Well, I hope you've all had a good lunch and are ready to go. We really appreciate the woohoos. I'm just saying. Woohoo! Woo! So this afternoon, we're going to cover a lot of ground. Some of this content is what we've been developing and, sort of figuring out how do we talk about the complexity of the issue. And so what you're about to see is still part of an emerging conversation about how do we convey these very sort of dense ideas in a way that people go, oh, I got it. I never thought about it that way. Because abuse intersects with all kinds of other issues, right? Like, it's not just abuse. We were talking this morning about the intersection between ageism and ableism, right? Like, that whole notion of after I said the word able-bodied, what does that mean, right? Is there a norm that is able-bodied? Is there a particular type that is the thing that we all aspire to? I think that's the problem, because every body is able-bodied, right? And we're differently abled, though. And so that's the kind of difference that we need to be figuring out, right? How to help people understand. How do we celebrate our differences? Because if we're all the same, it's not a very interesting planet. And so we want to celebrate difference. And so I'm going to show you now some of the content that we've been developing about how to talk about intersections. And then the panel is going to talk about a few of those intersections that happen with abuse. So I'm going to go back to the ecological model that I talked about this morning, that violence, and say. So at the individual level, we know that violence doesn't happen to everyone. And so what makes people more vulnerable? And who is abusing older adults? What we know is that most often it's family members, right? And it's adult children or grandchildren. And the research says that when it's adult children, it's most often a son. But abusers can also be other relatives or friends, paid or unpaid caregivers, right? People they know, people in positions of power and authority, right? Or trust. So it's the people right around us. And this is really sort of the logic of everything that we've been doing, is that what we learned in the research on the Neighbours, Friends and Families domestic violence program, which is where this whole story started, was that it's the people right around the family who know what's happening, and they don't know what to do about it. And so how do we mobilize? How do we support? How do we help people take the action that in their hearts they want to take, right, but don't know how? This is also from the research, and the research is very problematic for different reasons, that we're not actually, and I think that itself is an ageist problem, that we don't care enough about our older part of the population to do good research to understand how it's happening. So we know that older women are more likely to be harmed or killed. Older women are more likely to be harmed by a spouse, more likely to experience serious and repeat injuries, and that's across the lifespan. That's not just older women. Older men are more likely to be harmed or killed by a neighbor or acquaintance. And that, as I said, adult sons are most often the abusive family member. So can we figure out how to talk about sort of the way that violence happens through, a lens that adds layers to just looking at the individual? So I'm going to show you a little scenario now. This is we call this moving in. And for those of you who've been working with the scenario, we've renamed all the characters. So I'm just telling you, it's Michael and Carla. And I was told that I was supposed to, I don't know why, but Allison said I needed to do that. So Michael and Carla, okay, it's an announcement, I'm telling you now, Michael and Carla. And what I want you to do is just watch for the things that make you feel uncomfortable. Now, oh, and I'll say that Michael and his daughter, so he makes a reference to his daughter, are moving in with his mother.
Are you sure you're going to be comfortable in the basement?
Yeah, there's plenty of room, Mom. Besides, your granddaughter will never be home. Your life's as a mom. I don't know what I would have done without you.
I'm sure you're going to find another job in no time.
You mind if I watch a movie? By the way, your bank card was rejected at the gas station today. It was really embarrassing.
What are you talking about?
I went to fill up my car and it wouldn't go through. It must be overdrawn or something.
You better hope your check comes in this week. You're not going to get your prescriptions refilled. What are you doing?
I can't get used to the damp downstairs.
Oh, try another blanket, Mom. We're boiling up here.
No, I would have wished you would have asked me before you moved me into the basement.
Why? Do you have to be on my back, Mom? It's too dark and dingy down there. I get depressed, you know that. Complete your puzzles down there as well as you can up here.
What's for dinner, Grams? I'm starving.
Is it abuse? Somebody over there said, hello. So, you know, what are the warning signs? What are the risk factors? And what tips the balance of power? So this is the way that we unpack. We've got 10 of these scenarios, 6 of them very much in this kind of story, right? Happening in a family, sort of at the earlier end of the continuum, I would say. And so these are the really important questions for us as we're working with audiences to help them recognize, so what are the things that make you feel uncomfortable? And when does a situation move from, like when Michael first moves in, right? Like it seems like it's all good. And his mother, you know, has that look at the end where you go, but I know now what that would feel like, you know, to have my adult son moving back with me. I would have mixed feelings for sure. And, but it wouldn't mean that I didn't want to help him. So, you know, it's complicated. So the warning signs that we saw there, right, were we see the beginning of what is financial abuse. We're assuming, like, we don't want to jump to conclusions, right? Did she give him the PIN number? Does she know that he's using the bank card? Like, we don't actually know that. So that's one of the things that we want people to stick to. Stick to what you know in the situation, what's actually clear there. We know that there's you know, something happening in which his needs are more important than hers. And so she, you know, he made a decision to move her downstairs. And so these start to speak to some of the risk factors, that Michael is dependent and unemployed and they're living together. This is a risk factor for older adults when they live with someone. Now, when I read that the first time, I thought, what does that say about us as a species? Like, seriously. What does that say about us? That it's a risk factor when you're older to live with someone. He suffers from depression. He's drinking a beer, so we don't know. Maybe alcohol is a problem. We don't know that. And that's not to excuse the behavior, right? But it is to say that when abuse is present, alcohol and depression can sort of exacerbate the situation. And we can see that this is an escalating situation. The abusive behavior, the controlling behavior that we're seeing is that he moved Carla downstairs, he's taking, or he could be stealing her money, he completely has a disregard for her privacy, and he's reading her mail. His ageist attitudes, see the puzzles along the bottom, right? The ageism is always going to be part of this conversation. So he feels quite entitled to his mother's money, home, and time. And his mom's wants and needs are not as important. So how do we get there? How do we get to a point where, what started out as a good situation becomes a sliding down the tubes kind of situation? And do you think Michael, if you said to Michael, what you're doing is abusive, what do you think he would say? What are you talking about, right? I'm not being abusive. My mom wants to help me. Is that reasonable? I think so. I don't think he would recognize it. So we'll go back to this model and we'll focus here on Michael for a minute, but I'm going to add the other circles as we move out. If we stay here, if we only look at Michael, here's what's likely to happen. We're likely to blame Carla for allowing the situation to take place, or we're going to say, well, Michael, he's a bad egg, right? That's what happens if we just look at the individual, which is why it's so important to apply sort of a bigger lens to individual situations. Okay, now don't be frightened. I know there's a lot of words on the slide, and I promise I'm not going to read them all. But I want you to see the picture of a more complicated look at our lives. And so in the middle, we'll just look at the big words on the side, okay? So in the middle is the unique circumstances. Every single one of us has a unique set of circumstances that kinds of gives us a place in society. And there is a pecking order, right? Some people are more important than other people. And so where your place is in the pecking order is determined by all these other things. So the second circle, your aspects of identity. We talked about the relationships, those sorts of things. And then the third circle is how you experience discrimination because of your unique sort of identity situation. And then the outer circle is about the larger forces, the society, right? The bigger things that are at work. Okay, so for Carla, what are her unique circumstances? She's a woman of a certain age, she's a woman, and, her life experience. These are all things that will contribute to how she sees things, how she lives in the world. And, what she's experiencing as an aging woman, and, as an immigrant woman, like what are the things that she's had to deal with? How has this shaped us? And then that third outer ring about the economy is impacting her in a big way, right? Because Michael's moving home with her. So you have to think about, this is what makes this so hard, right? Is because every person is different. And so we just can't be applying like big categories, big lenses. We have to actually think about the person that's at the center and what their unique circumstances are. But we can talk generally about some of the large pieces like ageism and racism, because they kind of they're part of that larger circle that affect all of us, that influence the way we see things. So we have to be willing to do the same thing for Michael, to think about his unique circumstances and all those different layers of, of life and reality that put him in a place where he feels like he can do this. So if we accept that ageism and sexism are kind of like just part of the air that we breathe that is in our culture, we're trained really to see some people see the genders differently, then that forms like the foundation out of which grows this sense of entitlement. So Michael, he's younger and he's a man, and this gives him a certain social advantage if he needs it. And therefore his needs trump his mother's. Now, it's never to say we're going to excuse Michael's behavior. He's absolutely responsible for it. But it is to say it is his choice about how he uses that advantage. And what we know is that in tough economic times, violence rate goes up. Because that saying about things that roll downhill, that I'm not allowed to say at the podium, that's the way it works, right? And so as people fight for survival, the pressure goes down, so that the more reasons you're vulnerable in society, the more you carry the weight of everybody else. So it's a downward kind of thing. And so because Michael's trying to survive and look after his daughter, right, which is understandable, in a world where we don't really think about how ageism and sexism and racism and all the other ableisms and all those things contribute to the way we see ourselves, he feels entitled to take his mother's time, money, and resources. Does that make sense? You can tell me later if it doesn't. So again, we go back to, if we have a tendency to focus on the behavior and to judge Michael, right, for what's happening here as if it is strictly about him, when in fact there are other complicating pieces, all those different parts of the circle. So addiction and mental health may be part of the issue. Certainly the economy is playing into the situation. Maybe Michael's a guy who's been an upstanding kind of guy his whole life, but he's desperate. He can't find a job no matter what he does. And I don't want to hear about the stuff on the couch. Like, I know, but, you know, maybe he has been, you know, like maybe he's just going through a bad time kind of thing. Ageism, we talked about how ageism is a factor that his needs are more important than his mom's. That has, you know, that has a lot to do with sexism. Maybe, you know, all his life he's been looked after by his mom with an expectation that his needs are more important, which is not uncommon anywhere, right, in this part of the world. And, you know, there is a cultural expectation that parents will give up for their children, right, everywhere. And place, I think, makes a big difference, so that where you live in the country, where you live on the planet, can have a lot to do with your unique circumstances. And so these are all the things that we need to be willing to think about when we're talking about abuse. And you know, more than anything, what we want to do is figure out how to step away from quick judgments, that there are good people and that there are bad people. And I am not one of those bad people. Because as long as we are so invested in seeing ourselves as better than people who behave abusively, we're going to be trapped in the binary that doesn't allow us to really think about the ways in which we participate in the culture. Like, controlling behavior is everywhere. Like, if you have ever given someone the silent treatment, that is a form of controlling behavior because it's manipulative. You're trying to make something happen by applying a certain kind of pressure. And we do it because it works, right? But morally, I don't feel good about it. But I have to come to an awareness that that's actually controlling behavior. It's not actually what I want, right? So we're all implicated in ways that maybe we don't want to think about, but we're not so different from each other. And depending on what's happening in our lives, depending on how our survival is at stake or not at stake, we're going to respond differently. So it's very easy to live from a place of privilege where you have money and you don't worry about food and you have a place to live and you have people who are around you supporting you, right? You don't have to use your advantage because your survival is not being threatened. But I think for any one of us, if our survival is threatened, if my kids' lives are at stake, I'm probably capable of everything. So why a gender and intersectional lens? That's what we talk about. This is the language that people go, oh my God, really, Margaret? I'd rather have a root canal. But, you know, we have to learn to talk about this. The World Health Organization says that violence against women is a global epidemic, right? This is not just happening here, it's happening everywhere. And the Public Health Agency of Canada says that gender is actually a determinant of health. So if you're born male, female, or something in between, right, it determines a lot about how the quality of your life. And men and women experience violence differently. We would never say that men don't experience violence. They absolutely do, but it's different. And so if we're going to be effective in prevention and effective in our responses, then we have to have a differential approach, and we have to understand what those differences are. And each one of us has a complex identity with both social privilege and disadvantage. Can we start to think about the ways in which we are all, you know, we have advantages and disadvantages? Relationships are always complex. It's never a simple thing, right? It's always complicated. And we never want to say that using a gendered lens does not mean that men are bad and women are good. This is the biggest response that I've had sort of doing training, is that if you talk about a gendered lens and thinking about violence as a gendered issue, there's a way that people hear it that's saying, you know, you're saying men are bad, and that is not what we're saying at all. But the facts are that women are more likely to be killed or seriously injured. So that's a problem we need to deal with, right? And how do we engage men more actively? There's a lot of women in this room, and there's, you know, there's a handful of good men who are here with us. You know, always appreciate those representing the other. But how do we engage everyone in the issue? So that's, you know, those are the places that we're working in, that we want to add a sort of a more complex look at how these things happen so that we can get to what's actually going to make a difference. Okay, so Lily, are you going to introduce the panel? And if the panel would come to the front.
So in the middle? Sure. Are you second? Yes. Oh, very comfortable. Very comfortable.
So you guys are all wired for sound and everything?
I guess so, yeah. Yes.
Okay, great. So, so we wanted to continue this conversation about intersectionality with another fantastic panel, and so I'm really happy to be introducing them. On my immediate left is Lillian Nakamura-Maguire. She was the Senior Project Coordinator for the Pan-Canadian New Horizons for Seniors project called Empowering Yukon Seniors and Elders, Planning and Prevention Tools for the Yukon Public Legal Education Society in Whitehorse, Yukon. Lillian has worked educating people in adult ed and post-secondary settings, mostly in the Yukon, for more than 40 years. And she's going to bring the northern, rural, remote perspective. To Lillian's left is Dr. Mohammed Biaobaid, who is the Executive Director and founder of the Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration in Canada. He has worked for 30 years to develop culturally appropriate responses to family and youth violence both in Yemen and in Canada. And his work is highly innovative in building bridges across diverse Muslim and mainstream cultures. So welcome, Mohammed. And Susan McPhail is the director of the Community and Women's Programs for the Canadian Mental Health Association, Middlesex. Susan has been involved in social activism for over 40 years, and she's worked actively locally, provincially, and nationally to focus on the intersectionality between interpersonal violence, gender, trauma, mental health, addictions, poverty, and homelessness. So welcome, panel.
Oops.
Okay, I'll try not to do too much damage up here. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm just curious about how many people have experienced the Yukon? Yes. Oh, there's quite a few. I'm quite surprised. Great, I'm glad to hear that. I just want to acknowledge my colleague, Debbie Jansen, who's the It's Not Right coordinator for the Yukon. So she's here. And as well, Patricia Brennan, who's going to be coming later on this afternoon. She's from the Association Franco-Yukonese, so you'll have a chance to meet her later. But, okay, so I just want to give you a little bit of an idea of what the Yukon's about. So in terms of geography, it's a vast territory. It's larger than California, and as well, it borders Alaska, NWT, and BC. The population, according to December 2013 stats, is 36,500. And most of the people are concentrated in Whitehorse, which is the capital, and about 28,000 people. 10% of the population are over 65 years, and this number is increasing. And 25% of the population are Aboriginal people, and most of them are concentrated in the rural communities. The thing that surprised me actually is the Yukon's literacy level are the highest overall in Canada, but there is a big gap between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people. So the high school completion rate for Aboriginal people is much lower than for non-Aboriginal, and many of the older adults that I've worked with have not completed high school. We have 14 different First Nations. 11 have signed land claims and self-government agreements between 1993 to 2005. So we have a long history of negotiation. I just want to tell you that I'm a Japanese Canadian. I'm not an Aboriginal person. I'm speaking from my own, I guess, reflections. And, you know, I've also talked to my colleagues as well about some of their ideas. So in order for you to understand, you know, some of the issues that arise in the Yukon, I wanted to show you a little video that we've done. We actually developed 2 videos, My Friend Anne and John's Windfall, and they are based on the experience of social workers with the Senior Services Adult Protection Unit of the Yukon government. The reasons why I decided to try this approach, I'm kind of a closet filmmaker, to tell you the truth. But anyway, you know, there was this money, and I thought, wow, I've always wanted to use film as a way to tell stories. And so there is a tradition of storytelling in Aboriginal communities as a way to reinforce values and a way to teach. I also felt, because of the low literacy level of some people in the Yukon, using plain language and simply illustrated videos I thought would work. And the animation style also provides a bit of emotional distance from a very emotional topic. I chose not to use actors, mostly because of the cost of actors as well as filming. And I thought people could relate to these situations, these Yukon situations. I'm grateful to Arlen McFarland, who directed the video, and to Doug Urquhart, who illustrated them. And as you watch the films, I'd like you to think about the Yukon context and some of the issues that you think arise. So if you could play My Friend Anne. It's about 3 minutes. My friend Anne lives with her daughter Carol and Carol's husband, Fred. She decided to move there when she lost her husband. I wasn't too sure, but she seemed pretty determined. Carol has 2 adult kids, Jamie and Tara. And then Tara has 2 of her own. The house is a bit small. One morning, I went to pay Anne a visit. She looked really tired, but seemed pleased to see me. Tara's 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, was down for a nap. Anne was just going to make tea, when all of a sudden her grandson, Jamie, burst in demanding, "Grandma, got $20 to lend me? Gotta go downtown." And just like that, she gives it to him. And he just yells, "Thanks," over his shoulder. Then Tibby burst in from school and started frantically making himself a peanut butter sandwich. It was crazy. While Anne was making tea, I inquired if he asked for money often. She said, maybe $20 a couple times a week. She thought she'd be saving money, but seems like it all goes to buying stuff for the family. Groceries, things for the kids. She hasn't been out to play bingo, and none of her old friends except me has visited. She doesn't even get a nap in the afternoon. I told Anne that at the age of 75, she deserved time for herself. She doesn't even feel like she can say anything to her daughter, Carol. She pretty much just feels helpless. So with these two videos, this and the other one is John's Windfall, and I did little booklets that go along with it. They're basically the film with some discussion questions at the end. These are on our website, and I do have some copies for the community of practice folks, so if you'd like a copy, certainly you can take one, they're free. And they're also on our website, so you can download them. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some issues, I guess, that came up for me when I started to use these and also work in this area. So after showing my friend Anne, I recall one of the women who worked in the social services field for a First Nations government said, "That's me, you know, Anne is me." And she said that she provided support for her family as a babysitter. She worked full-time, but she did do quite a bit of babysitting for them, and financially and emotionally she supported them. And she said that she saw it as a part of her role in the family, teaching and caring of her grandchildren and being a support to the family. She didn't see that as abuse, although she seemed to recognize that, you know, she was under a lot of stress, physically, emotionally, and financially. And for many older Aboriginal women, their role as grandmother is important to them and to others. In Aboriginal communities, elders are often less isolated than non-Aboriginal people. And they are often included in community gatherings, elders' council meetings, they're teaching at cultural camps, they are active participants and decision makers in general council meetings of First Nations governments. This provides intergenerational contact and opportunities for many people to include elders in the everyday workings of the community. In some rural communities, you see more elders living with family members due to limited housing, the cost of housing, as well as providing mutual support. Respect of elders is a core value of Aboriginal communities, although people certainly recognize that it isn't always followed by everyone, and elders can be subject to abusive situations. In contrast, many non-Aboriginal older adults who have moved to the Yukon early in their life are either single with no family members in the territory or may no longer have children living in Yukon. The children have moved elsewhere for employment, leaving the older adult with no family support. In addition, there's this image of the rugged individualists in the Yukon. This is a person who's independent, they're resourceful, they're reluctant to ask for any help. As these individuals have grown older, some of them may no longer be able to care for themselves, and they remain isolated and may be more subject to abuse by others. I think there's also the attitude, as has been described earlier, when people see abuse, you know, they just want to mind their own business and not get involved. A big issue, of course, that impacts many Aboriginal people is the legacy of residential schools. Many parents and grandparents attended residential schools, and all of them experienced some kind of trauma. I've talked to a First Nations counselor working with former residential school survivors who are parents and grandparents. And he noted how some of them have such caring and concern for their children and grandchildren, they tend to overcompensate and are generous financially and otherwise, to the point where some are taken advantage of. Some may also have feelings of guilt for not having provided for their own children or been abusive in raising them. The intergenerational impact of the abuse experienced by them early in their life can repeat itself in generations that follow. Living in small rural communities provides some real challenges when abuse occurs. Everyone knows each other, and often they are related. So these relationships are intertwined and difficult to deal with the issue directly. There may be fear of withdrawal of support or intimidation and harassment by the abuser, who often is related to them. People being abused are reluctant to tell anyone else. Although the community members may know it is happening, they're reluctant to intervene. There's a lack of resources to support those experiencing abuse and to those who may be the abuser. In my travels throughout the territory, I've been in many communities where the social worker or the community nursing position was vacant or being covered by a regional person from living in another town. In addition, there's a lack of support for abusers who may have alcohol addiction or mental health problems. So some of the lessons that I've learned, I found Aboriginal communities to often be more open to talking about abuse than non-Aboriginal communities. In recent presentations with non-Aboriginal groups, Debbie Jensen, the INR coordinator, has found it difficult to encourage people to attend the sessions, but once they're there, they are open to talking about it, but resources are somewhat limited for follow-up support that may be required. The services for the growing older population at times is lagging behind. And questions also arise about the ethical issue of opening the conversation and then not having follow-up resources readily available. In my discussions with Aboriginal elders who served on the stakeholder advisory group that I had, they suggested to plan any educational activity about abuse of older adults from the core values of showing respect, maintaining the dignity and safety of older adults. It was important to them that we show positive examples of how family members and others and what they've done to provide that kind of positive support. This is a positive way to bring people into the discussion of abuse of older adults. First Nation communities have much to teach us as non-Aboriginal people about the inclusion of older adults in the community life and the value of intergenerational contact. Elders play an important role in Aboriginal communities and are called upon for their knowledge and experience. And I believe that it's important for us to take in those values of respect, maintaining dignity, harmony, and the safety of older adults. Those are principles that we need to think about, and we need to provide these positive examples. On our website, actually, we have some video clips of some people who spoke during our conference, and they talked about positive examples. So I want to thank you for the opportunity of sharing our learnings from the Yukon, and hope it provided some insights to you. Thanks.
Yeah. Good afternoon. So my presentation will be brief. I'm going to show you a video clip, and after that, I'll go with you through some of the key questions that I would think will give us a better understanding of the cultural context in terms of elder abuse in this video. So it's a video that shows an old woman who has a conversation with her, he has a situation with her son, and present different segments of abuse, of elder abuse. And there will be two different responses, two different scenarios of responses. So if you just start maybe with this video, and then I will continue the conversation with my questions. Thank you.
Here to live in this country with his family. He looks after me, my health, my finances. He is a good man.
Of course I respect my mother. It's how I was raised. We honor our parents.
I'm no longer as young as I once was. My son and daughter-in-law work while I raise their children, get them ready for daycare, school, make them breakfast, lunch, and dinner, do the housework. I don't want to sound ungrateful, but life here is so different.
No, it's like she doesn't appreciate all that I do for her. She looks for things to complain about.
Jamal takes care of my money. I don't see my paychecks or bank statements. Of course, if I ask for a little extra shopping money for myself, he makes a fuss. I have everything. But yet, nothing of my own.
She embarrasses me with all her complaining.
My life here is so different from what I expected. I want to go home.
She said that? That she wants to go back home. To what?
I'm afraid he'd be upset if I asked. He's already done so much for me.
I've given her everything, and I get nothing but grief in return.
My son is a good man, but he doesn't listen.
Sorry, we don't have the responses on the video, but so as maybe you have seen, it's a different context of elder abuse from what we have been hearing this morning, the different presentations and the different videos. It really talks and shows elder abuse in individualistic contexts, where the focus is really mainly to ensure the safety of elders, the physical, emotional, and financial safety of the elders, whereby, for example, in this video, the focus is really on a collectivist context, where the issue of abuse or violence or needed to be understood within a relationship in this collectivist context. So what I have seen in this video, actually, maybe two main questions that I would like to raise here, and that would help us better understand the cultural context in this video. So I think there is two stories. What are the first story is really the mother's story. So we want to know what are the key elements in the mother's story. So what are her focus here? And at the same time, also we want to see what are the key elements in the son's story. So there are different stories, two stories. And then what would be, for example, the ideal responses to support the mother in this situation? When we did this, and then I see. So the focus here is really on roles. So the focus of the mother's story, the conversation, is really about what is expected from her culturally, socially, in terms of her role as a mother. So that's really, I think, what drives, how she would tell her story and what is, bothering her in this situation. And I can see, for example, a few keywords here that the mother was, emphasizing. One is really, she was always saying, my son is a good man. So it's beyond abuse or beyond, for example, what would happen to her. She would not see herself as a victim of abuse. She mainly focusing more on the positive. So that's her son, and he would not do any harm to her. So I think that's the one perspective. So the other thing also that I would maybe like to highlight here, she would consider her coming to Canada is a favor that her son did a favor to her. So he brought her to Canada. So then she needs to be grateful for that. I think this is really important to understand how she would make sense of what is happening to her. Also, another key words, he doesn't listen. I think for me, the word listen I'm originally coming from Yemen, in a collectivist context mean obeying. So he would not obey me. So there is expectations for sons and daughters to obey their parents, and they have to be ready to support them when they get older. So I think that's a kind of complaint that, maybe she would like to have some support with this respect. When we go to the sons' conversation or statements, we see, for example, what are the key questions or the key elements here? I think respect to his mother is one of the key elements that he was raising. So he was saying, you know what, I respect my mother the way, for example, my parents raised me. So maybe for him, respect means that he brought her to Canada to get maybe better, health care, better, life. But also at the same time, it's not necessarily what she is looking for. Another word that also I heard him saying, honor my parents. So those are really two key words, I think, that could show us what is really important in terms of norms, cultural norms, in terms of values for the son and for the parents. So I think maybe beyond of what we would think as service providers who may be supporting victims of violence, or maybe holding perpetrators accountable. I think we need to understand, we don't need to see things beyond that. So within a different context would be different concept of what's accountability. So maybe in this context, the accountability is really to the culture, to the cultural norms that, for example, where they're coming from. Those are really, it's very interesting to see, how, for example, the mother perceives her situation. She needs help, of course, and her help is really, and the solution to go back to where she came from. So that's really what she proposed as help. For the son, of course, maybe he would not see that his mother is here to support him and to support his wife, and also to support the kids. So the only thing that he would see that he is supporting her by bringing her to Canada. In terms of responses, actually, in one of the videos, there was two different responses, two different scenarios. The one response, sorry that's not here, but in the first response, the first scenario, somebody was, the mother was talking, but then the person who she was talking to is another woman from the same culture. So the response of this third person focused more on blaming the mother, and also really not making her feel ungrateful for what has her son did to her, for her, and also really warning her from bringing shame to the family by asking for outside help, and discouraging her from asking for any help from outside. And I think maybe this response, actually, I would consider this kind of response as role-oriented response, which really means that the focus is really on role expectation. So as a mother, you should really keep this secret within the family. This is your son. You don't bring shame to the family. So I think as service providers, we can imagine if you have a woman who is experiencing this kind of violence, in first place, maybe you would not know actually that she is experiencing this kind of abusive behavior. But it's important to really understand, even when we meet with this kind of woman, what kind of question we ask. And maybe creating questions based on what she would tell or how she would tell her story. So that's I would consider this as a role-oriented. So the focus here is really on a role. And if you would not really fulfill your expected role as a mother, so then you are the one who will bring shame to the family. And that would better for her maybe to suffer than to come forward and ask for help. The second scenario actually was somebody maybe who was talking with her with a more Western-oriented kind of language, and that's maybe could be a service providers. And the focus is really here on really basically this voice was trying to tell her, you know what, you did the right thing, you should, the blame should be, he's the one who needs to be blamed, not you. You did the right thing. It's really about empowering her, reassuring, and encouraging her also to maybe go further and make a decision for what is important to her. And maybe at one point we will show this response. Actually, it's a very interesting responses. This voice was actually emphasizing the choices. You should really make a decision based on what you think is good for you or best for you. And I think in a collectivist context, especially with an older woman or older person, it's really difficult to see, individual choices based on individual interests, because the self itself is rooted within the collective entity. So then she would get maybe more, I would say, joy by being part of this family, sacrificing more than getting support for herself. So now, as a conclusion of this, I really maybe at one point want to show the.
Okay, do you want me to do it now?
I don't know. It's
I can do it.
my time. Are you okay with that? Yeah. So then.
So I'll play it from here.
Yeah. Sorry.
I'm sorry, Mohammed. It's all my fault.
Oh,
We're
I don't
not
know.
perfect.
I was not sure how to start. Actually, I thought maybe I will ask questions, but then it's okay.
We had a
No,
miscommunication.
no, it's okay.
Okay, you have to talk to them while I'm looking for it. Otherwise, I feel a lot of pressure.
No. Okay. This is how we talk, Margaret and I. So we're not realizing that there's so many people here around.
Yeah, usually it's private.
Yeah.
So which one do you want me to show?
So the first one.
The first one? You want to show both of them?
Yes. Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
so
one of them.
Steve, will we be able to flip this if I just go? Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
My son is a good man, but he doesn't listen.
I know it's hard, Peter, but this is the way it's always been. It could be worse. You don't want to bring shame to your family. It's not worth it. Try to be happy.
The second one.
Oh, second one right away? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
So that's the first scenario where you see it's really empowering.
Okay.
Second one.
My son is a good man, but he doesn't listen.
I know he's a good man. He expects a lot. But you expect a lot from yourself as well. It's your life here. Whatever you decide, what's best for you?
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think that would help a little bit. And
Okay.
Okay.
I'll buy you lunch.
No, don't worry. So I think just really I see two different responses. One of them is really emphasizing the roles, the expected role for a mother, so really, which really means that you can't go further and ask for outside help. And the other one is encouraging her and to support her choices. And I think maybe both these responses, I would say maybe, it really depends on the context. But what I would really like to see as an ideal response is an integrative kind of response that integrates both. Because sometimes what would happen if we think, for example, we're helping, and then we emphasize the choices, maybe it's most likely that the woman will not come to us again. Because we show her what is there, but we don't really understand what kind of dilemma she would go through and whether she would be ready to go through this experience emotionally. Maybe intellectually she will understand that, but then, she would stuck somehow. I would really look for something integrative so that maybe we can be creative for future direction to think what would be the ideal integrative model of responses. As a conclusion, I would say context is key. And I see, for example, in this scenario, in this video, expectations based on roles and not based on rights. So coming from a collectivist background, it's a role-oriented society or communities, and here is individual, like rights-oriented. Everybody has a right, a child, a woman, a man, and everybody, which is not wrong. I'm not really saying that's right or wrong, but just really to understand the context when you work with, a different cultural background. I also really see respect and shame are really key to better understand the context. It's not really about, it's important to see the perspectives. So what really encouraged this woman to ask for help is really whether that will bring shame to the family, whether that's something respectful or not. It's a conversation that we need to have. We don't have time now, but really something that we need to think of in the future when we design or develop any kind of intervention or responses to elder abuse. But also that's also true for women abuse and child abuse. And thank you very much.
So I'm going to talk about the intersectionality, that great word, that I first learned from Barb McQuarrie. I remember when I heard that word, I thought, what does that mean? It's so cool. So I like to throw it around a lot because So I want to talk about the intersectionality of mental health, mental illness, and I want to talk about that terminology as well, addictions and trauma. And when Margaret asked me and invited me to come and do this, I said, I don't know anything about this, really. And then I began to place myself in the context of this conversation. And so I just want to share a little bit about that with you because I think that informs what I'm going to talk to you about in my experience. So first of all, I'm speaking to you as an aging person, and I loved what someone said, we're really all aging people, but in the last few years, I've been getting the seniors discount. And so I'm in that other aging group, and also I'm in the group of people who are now referring to me as dear and sweetie and sweetheart, which I just am not, I'm like, what? I'm not your sweetheart, but anyways. Or you're so cute, that kind of diminutive. Yes, people understand this. And second of all, I'm speaking to you as a family member. So my mother-in-law was diagnosed early in her life with paranoid schizophrenia. And she has mostly remained at home in the care of her family. And so in recent years, this has been a very interesting journey for all of us to love, care, and support her and my father-in-law as they live in really acute isolation within this context of a serious mental illness. And then I'm going to talk to you about someone who's worked in the mental health field and in the violence against women field for a long, long time. And those fields do overlap. and who I remembered, and I don't know how I forgot, but as a frontline mental health worker, I facilitated a group for older women. And this was in my younger years, for over 20 years, believe it or not. This group was called Passages, and it was for women who had been in psychiatric institutions. And so that was a very interesting experience for me, and it informed me a lot in terms of my understanding of the risk and the vulnerability for women who have had long histories of psychiatric involvement, which I now would call who've had long histories of trauma and violence. And then more recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, I've been very involved in community outreach mental health programs for people who are experiencing homelessness. Mostly women, and then in the last couple of years, and one of my colleagues is here with me, men as well. And I've really seen, especially in Ontario, in the last 15 years, as we have deinstitutionalized and as our social safety nets have completely deteriorated, I've seen this alarming trend of an increase of older women who have long histories of mental health involvement, trauma and violence, who are falling into the margins at rapid rates. It's probably our largest growing population, who are homeless, at risk of homeless, living in shelters, living in their cars, and at great risk, whose families, for no fault of their own, have not been able to hang in there, as my father-in-law has been able to, but whose families, for all kinds of complicated reasons, have had to step away, and who now are virtually on their own and who are at great risk in their communities, on the street, in shelters, or wherever they may be. Our oldest woman was 92. And just in the last year, we've had a few women in their 70s who've been living in their cars in the middle of the winter. And too embarrassed to, well, some of these people did have families, but too embarrassed to tell their families that they'd lost their housing. And this is happening in our country at great rates. If you talk to any urban setting or even rural setting, you will hear stories of women in particular, but men as well, who are living in abject poverty as they're aging and who are dying. And so those deaths, I consider that to be another form of elder abuse, because it is death from neglect, from chaos, from extreme poverty, and from sheer systemic failure to support our communities. And then more recently, I have this beautiful daughter who I was hoping would be here with me today, who just graduated from social work, and she has an absolute passion. She's on fire about elders and the whole thing that we're talking about. So she is also working in a long-term care home, what I used to call a nursing home. And she comes home from her shifts, and we have lots of conversation about the stories she hears, the things she sees, the abandonment that she sees of the people she's working with, and the frustration of staff, the lack of training that staff have, all the systemic issues around the caregiving in that particular context. So these things all lead me to think a lot about how it's imperative that when we approach this topic, we really need to be coming at it from a trauma and violence informed perspective. And what does that mean? But we really need to look at people's lives along their lifespan and the stories that their lives tell. We need to really think about a gender analysis, as Margaret and others have so eloquently talked about, and we absolutely must place this within a cultural context. So I was so grateful to Alan for starting our day off talking about colonialism and how that really is much more than just talking about the incredible shame we should feel and the action we must take around First Nations Aboriginal communities, but beyond that, how colonialism affects how we construct ourselves and think about ourselves and respond to each other. So I think it's really important that we place everything within a trauma and violence-informed analysis approach, within a relational cultural context, and we also really ground it within a harm reduction context. So often, and in mental health, we talk a lot about mental health and addictions. How many of you understand what harm reduction means? Just So it's a common concept. And I think now we're really understanding how we can broaden it and think about it so much more broadly than just around substance use. But we can think about it around violence, domestic violence, and we can apply a harm reduction lens to really any situation of risk or where safety is of a concern. My mom had worked in early years of hospice and palliative care. She was one of the pioneers in that movement, and she used to say a lot that you really could see so much about a person's dying and what those last days or times would be like from the context of their life story, because very often that life story informed the ending as well, or it kind of bubbled through. And I think that's really true when we look at elder abuse, that when we look at it within the context of the complexity of the family relationships, it speaks volumes. So when we were looking at that video of the fellow who had moved his mother down to the basement, I thought, I wonder what life was like when he was a child and what was happening to mom with dad and all those kinds of complex relationships, because I think a lot of that bubbles up and through. And then I do want to just also mention about mental illness. How many people work in mental health? I always think I have to maybe make a little apology, because I like to damn my sector a lot, because I think it's archaic. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I stay in it, but I think it's punitive and it lacks a social analysis and a cultural analysis, and it often hurts people more than it helps. So I often struggle myself when I speak about mental illness, because I think really it's about people who are feeling emotional distress, and that if we really understood the context from which they came, that would be a normal response, would be to have that level of emotional distress. So when I talk about mental health and mental illness, please understand that I'm coming from that perspective. So bear with me for a moment. So there is some really interesting research as well around dementia and around cognitive impairment. And there's really interesting emerging research around the link between dementia and cognitive impairment and the likelihood of the possibility of previous trauma in one's life. So that's, I think, interesting research. It's fairly new and something to really be reflective of when we're talking about elder abuse and we're talking about the dynamics in family relationships within that. In terms of mental health, so the prevalence of mental health issues in adults over 65 are currently estimated to be as high as 30 to 40%. That, as has been mentioned before, does increase a person's vulnerability. Women with mental health issues and addictions can be even more vulnerable to harassment or violence. We've talked about this, but also when you add the other layers that Margaret spoke about, when we add layers of poverty, age, and other kinds of ability issues, that increases a person's vulnerability. There's a very close connection, as we know, between mental health issues, substance use issues, and gendered violence. And women who are survivors of violence, trauma, and abuse often, frequently, have coexisting issues of mental health and substance abuse. So there's no current reliable stats on the overall prevalence of mental illness in the Canadian population, but it is estimated, and it's higher now, that 1 in 20 Canadians will experience a mental illness at some point in their life. And the incidence of mental illness can really increase over the lifespan. And partly, especially as we age, this can be due to just life catching up with us, losses, grief, unresolved trauma, the complexity of life, of life events can really manifest as a person ages and compound with anxiety and depression and substance use. And so just going back to the story of my mother-in-law. So I wanted to share two stories with you that kind of places risk around elder abuse within a cultural relational context. So my mother-in-law and father-in-law, Middle Americans, upwardly mobile, product of post-war and 1950s. Stayed home, Irish Catholic family, many children. Diagnosed, she was a beautiful, talented, brilliant woman, diagnosed young with paranoid schizophrenia. The family wanted to keep this a secret, obviously, and so all kinds of things went into play to compensate, to control. The kids really played into that. The maneuvers of this family are amazing to watch in terms of just trying to keep life copacetic when life is anything but copacetic. And so the whole goal of this family has been to try and keep everything as sane as it possibly can be in the middle of lots of unbelievable insanity, really. In recent years, I've often thought, is this really paranoid schizophrenia we're looking at? You know, there's a wonderful phrase about reading the language of symptoms and just really listening to the language that the symptoms are portraying. And so as I sit and chat with my mother-in-law and hear a lot of her delusions, quote unquote, and her hallucinations, I think, this sure sounds like a story to me, a story that is grounded in reality, that has been manifested in her in this particular way so that she can find a way to navigate life with this story. So in recent years, families that have this kind of level of serious mental health manifestation often become very, very isolated, as you may know, because people just abandon them. It's very hard to be with them. And so the family has formed this very tight little enclave of support for each other. But, you know, caregivers can't come in, and so there's no relief. So my father-in-law, you can imagine, is exhausted. I mean, they can't go to a retirement home. No one will possibly take them. They can't have caregivers in. They run out the door within a week. And so it's up to the children and to the family. So the dad, who is this upwardly mobile person, was very, very, very controlling, as he felt he needed to be in order to keep the lid on this family. And in recent years, everyone has assessed this to be a potential risk to my mother-in-law. But then, as he's become exhausted and cannot care anymore, the risk has flipped to him because of how she is in the world and her anger and who knows what else. And so it's a very interesting story to untangle, and it's a very complex set of circumstances to respond to. There's no good person, there's no bad person. There's a family history that is full of strength and resiliency and incredible capacity and resourcefulness, and full of deep grief and loss. And so I just, as we talk and listen today, I think about that story. And I know we're almost out of time. I'm just going to flip it and tell you very quickly another story that we've been involved in lately with an older woman. I've done lots and lots of work in and with Aboriginal communities, which has also informed my, my orientation and my practice. Thankfully, I'm very grateful for that. And we were working with an older Aboriginal woman, a Cree woman, who had transferred down from a northern community to care for her grandson who was coming out of jail. She was homeless, he was homeless, and there was all kinds of things going on. But they had they had such a deep bond and such a deep love for each other, even though there was mental health. And so she had been a residential school survivor, which that context had been missed by the numerous caregivers all around everyone. And the way these two incredible people were responded to by the circles of care around us that we were trying to navigate just blew the situation out of the water and resulted in so much more harm to two individuals who, where there was risk, there was no question about it around elder abuse, where there was concern, but where there was also a context that had been missed. And it grieved us very much that they had, that cultural relational context had been so gravely misunderstood, and that more harm and more risk had been done to them by the very forces that were there to help. So I really don't have conclusions. I only have stories to share and my own thoughts about this. But I do believe, and I just want to reinforce again, the notion of placing and understanding the relational context, the cultural context, and making sure that our trauma and violence and gender lens is sharp and clear to help us navigate these really complex waters.
Thank you so much. Again, I think you, all three of you, did just a fabulous job of showing the complexity and the harm we do when we don't have the insight to and want to, for probably our own security, sort people into piles of good and bad people. So thank you. Okay, so you have a, so how long do we want to do though?
Well,
because we're...
what do you want, Susan? Your glasses? Oh, the glasses.
So we have a table discussion and we're just negotiating. See, we're
we
on schedule for the break.
So let's have the break and then we'll have the table discussion. So if they
At
come back
3
at
o'clock?
3? Yeah.
Okay, so have a great time, talk. Don't forget to put stuff over there. Don't forget to talk to people you haven't met.